This is Entei, and the huge guy behind it is their trainer, Cypher admin Dakim. Taking place in the mid-game of Pokemon Colosseum, this fight marked the first time ever where a boss in a Pokemon story campaign used a legendary. Since Colosseum, there have been multiple other instances of NPC trainers using legendaries, such as N in Black and White and Hop in Sword and Shield. But this battle against Dakim, Dakim? Da Vinci? I don't know, man. This battle is distinct from others like it in that it's much more challenging, and it's not just because of Entei. Anyone who's played Colosseum would know just how much of a difficulty spike Dakim is, but why is that? My name is Sparkle, and I'm a top-level Colosseum speedrunner. Today, I'll be showing you how the fight against Dakim works and how speedrunners win with only 2 Pokemon. You ready? Before I can answer the question of why this fight is so difficult, we first need to understand the playing field. What makes Pokemon Colosseum different from other games in the series is that every battle in the main campaign is in the doubles format. Compared to singles, doubles is more dynamic as there are more decisions and thus more outcomes in one turn. Take this 1v1 scenario for example. There's a few options for the player here, but it's not really that complex. However, when you add a second Pokemon on both sides, there's suddenly a lot more questions to answer. For a casual player who lacks experience with this format, it can be a bit overwhelming. Now, in mainline Pokemon games, double battles are present, but are mostly sidelined in favor of single battles, typically only being reserved for a gym leader's gimmick or teaming up with an NPC in the story. Even though double battles are more complicated, Colosseum gives the player time to get used to and experiment in the format, and later on, new concepts are introduced that challenge the player without feeling unfair. Well, Dakim is a little unfair, but the point is he tests the player by taking advantage of the double style. So with all that being said, let's talk about the actual fight itself. To do that, I'm gonna break things up into a few segments and explain them individually. I'll be going into Dakim's team composition, the options the player has against it, and a secret third thing. A special mechanic that only exists in Colosseum and nowhere else in the series, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First off, let's go over what kind of team we're up against. Despite his ace being a fire type, Dakim's team is mostly comprised of ground types, along with the steel psychic Matank for some defensive variety. While that may seem redundant, these ground types all serve unique purposes due in part to their dual typings. But while kinda cool, the rest of Dakim's team besides Entei does not seem that impressive. However, there's something about it I haven't mentioned yet, and to many of you it might be an elephant in the room. An ostrich in the elevator. 3 members of Dakim's party know both Earthquake and Protect. Now, anyone familiar with VGC would know how dangerous a combination this can be. Protect is really good in doubles, letting you make one of your Pokemon invulnerable for a turn while the other can accomplish something else, which in Dakim's case would be abusing Earthquake's powerful spread damage without the repercussion of his own side getting hit. Now, some of you may be thinking that Colosseum's AI wouldn't be smart enough to do this, which, you know what, that's fair. But this is where the fun begins, because as it turns out, Dakim has special AI specifically for this purpose. When Dakim has 2 Earthquake users in play, they will alternate between Earthquake and Protect every turn, which can be very annoying to deal with. Even for experienced players, if you don't come prepared, you'll be seeing a lot of Earthquake over the course of the fight. So even if you do manage to get past it, your team will be heavily worn down by that point. And that's when you get finished off by the big dog. Entei's not actually a dog, I just said that for emphasis. If you call these the legendary dogs, you're going in the spank machine. Ouch! Looking at Entei, there's a few traits here that stand out straight away. For one, it's a whopping level 40, which at this point in the game, your average team level without grinding is around 35 to 36. On top of that, it knows Fire Blast, and while Entei isn't really known for its special attack, it's still pretty decent by Gen 3 standards, and at the end of the day, it's a 180 base power move. That's a lot. But obviously, there's one thing about Entei that definitely sticks out the most. I know, Spencer with a smoothie moment, you got me. Dakim's Entei is a Shadow Pokemon. Okay, what does that mean? Well, Shadow Pokemon as a whole could easily be its own video, but in the context of the Dakim fight, there's 2 very important traits to remember, which actually make Entei even more dangerous than it already seems. First off, all Shadow Pokemon know the move Shadow Rush, a 90 power physical attack with minor recoil damage. Notably, this move has the unique Shadow type, which in Colosseum hits neutrally into every type in the game. This makes it difficult to hold off Entei defensively, as no matter what, it will always have the option of hitting you with an unresisted move coming off its high attack stat. The second trait is something that arguably benefits Entei even more. Shadow Pokemon used by the AI have higher stats than what a non-Shadow would have. You see, in Colosseum, almost every Pokemon used by enemy trainers have their IVs and natures preset in the game's code. Notably, their IVs are always set to 0 in every stat. This is a common balancing measure seen in older Pokemon games to make them easier, which in Colosseum's case, yeah, I could see that being reasonable. However, Shadow Pokemon are the exception to this rule. If you didn't know, in Pokemon Colosseum, there are no wild encounters. You're instead meant to steal Shadow Pokemon from the goons of Cypher, the evil organization of the game. Because Shadow Pokemon are essentially a stand-in for wild Pokemon, they share pretty much all the same traits, namely random IVs, random natures, and even the chance of being shiny. So on top of Entei already having a very high level and base stat total relative to your party at this point, it also has inflated stats due to having random IVs. Which, if you would kindly direct your attention to this comparison, yeah, what the hell? And if you're thinking that you can just cheese Entei by catching it, yeah, if you want to be a Germa, go ahead.
Oh my, what a piece of shit.
Now that we have a pretty clear idea of what Dakim's all about, what options does the player have to beat it? Well, now I think is a good time to talk about why this fight is so much more challenging compared to other legendary trainer fights. Let's go over the aforementioned N and Hop fights to see how they function, which you'll find are actually pretty similar. They both use the cover legendaries of their respective games, and while they're way stronger than Entei in a vacuum, there's a couple key things to note about their fights that make them a lot more manageable. First, the player is forced to catch the counterpart cover legendary before the fight begins, which pretty drastically evens the playing field. Secondly, both fights take place at the very end of the game's stories, so it's safe to assume that the player would already have a fully developed party of which they had many different Pokemon to choose from. So even without the legendaries, the fights would still be far from impossible. Now let's compare that to Dakim. This is a random boss fight in the middle of the game. Your team is likely not finished because you haven't seen half the Pokemon you can catch yet, and the maximum number of Pokemon you can have up to this point? 21. If you're older than the pre-Dakim living decks, go ahead and type booyah in the comments. There isn't too much potential for team diversity here, which Colosseum is mildly infamous for. But to give credit where it's due, the game does give you plenty of good options for Dakim. Here's this neat little tier list I made ranking the available Pokemon for this fight. And to prevent myself from being here for an hour, I'll just go through each tier briefly. This list assumes that Shadow Pokemon are purified and also basically minimal grinding, because obviously with enough grinding, anybody can be high society if they try hard enough. I'm going into 2nd grade next year. Starting from the bottom, we have does not do anything. They do not do anything. The Mons in this tier basically just get destroyed by Earthquake and don't really provide anything to make up for it. Not really much more to say. Next up, we have my personal favorite tier, the Potential Brothers. Now, I know I just said I was gonna be brief with each tier, but dude, it's the Potential Brothers. Now, at first glance, the Potential Brothers are complete ass. Remoraid, for some reason, is the only Shadow in the game to start at level 20, and Yanma is... it's Yanma, like what are you gonna do, Sonic Boom? But with an abnormally high amount of investment, these two can shine. If you level up Remoraid a lot, you get Artillery Bubble Beam, like dude, boom, 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 they all go down. And if you beat Phoenix Stadium 3 times, you get the Giga Drain TM for, yeah, Yanma, so you beat Marshtomp and Golem. Dude, this is so epic sauce. Unfortunately for the Potential Brothers, there are quite literally better versions of them that don't take hours to set up, so I'm just gonna stay chillin' down here. For the mid tier, I didn't really order it because they're all just kind of 5 out of 10s anyway. Some of them do decent damage, some can status, some are ground immune. Yeah, you can use them. Next is the niche tier, and the title pretty much speaks for itself. These mons can be very strong under the right circumstances, but outside of their main utility, they won't last very long. And now we have reached high society. So Dakim's team composition is primarily made up of bulky physical attackers with low special defense, and it notably has a glaring weakness to water. The high society tier is made up of ladies and gentlemen that take advantage of at least one of Dakim's weaknesses, while also being able to stick around for multiple turns, unlike those in the tier below. Quagsire and Feraligatr have good bulk and access to Surf, which if you didn't know, does not hit your teammate in this game. Espeon can fire off strong Psybeams and can support Surf users with Helping Hand. Hitmontop has Intimidate, that's it, and Mantine has the best possible typing for this fight, along with a pretty solid attack. In general, if you have a high society member on your team, the fight becomes significantly easier. So, there you go. I pretty much explained to you how to beat Dakim. Honestly, it doesn't seem that complicated. Just bring some high society members and should be free, right? Yay! Yay! Well, remember when I said that this fight is a little unfair? Yeah, so none of what I've said in the video so far has actually been in reference to that yet. See, Colosseum's main gimmick is that the only Pokemon you can catch are in trainer battles, right? In most Pokemon games, when you defeat a trainer, you can't battle them again, and you could probably imagine how that could be bad with a system like Colosseum's. Now, the devs did think of this as a huge amount of trainers in the game can be refought, including ones that have shadow Pokemon, like those in Pyrite Square and Pyrite Cave. However, there's a fair amount of battles that take place as part of a story-relevant cutscene, which cannot be refought upon completion. And almost all of them have shadow Pokemon. If you end up defeating these trainers without catching their shadows, you won't be able to try again until very late in the game, well after Mount Battle. So, say you're a weak-minded child, and you made it all the way to Dakim using only Espeon and Umbreon, without catching anything else. If you, understandably, have some trouble with the fight and want to go back and maybe catch some shadows, what would your options look like then? Well, here's all the available Pokemon for the fight if you don't miss any. And this is when you miss them all. Notice anything different? The game straight up locks you out of your best counters to Dakim if you skip them. That's kind of unfair. This is a genuine scrub check that punishes first-time players for not catching every Pokemon they see. Some of the skippable shadow fights like Mantine can be really annoying, so a first-time player might think to just beat the fight then and catch them later, or not even catch them at all because maybe they just don't like Mantine. That's a very normal thing to do. This just gives the fight so much artificial difficulty, and it's just lame. Like, why are you being punished for not catching Pokemon you don't care about? But moving on, do you remember the super, special, secret mechanic that you've oh so patiently been waiting for this whole video? Yeah, let's talk about it. This unique quirk of Colosseum is actually very simple in concept. Some trainers just don't always lead the same Pokemon. Now, I didn't make it sound very exciting, but it changes how the game plays more than you'd think. Here's an example. Imagine you're fighting against Platinum Cynthia, who famously leads with her Spiritomb, a bulky attacker. You end up losing, but now that you know she leads with Spiritomb, you adjust your own lead to be a better fit to deal with it. Pretty standard stuff, right? But when you start the battle again, Cynthia instead leads with Lucario, rendering your adaptation useless. And on the next attempt, she then leads Milotic, then Roserade, then Togekiss. This randomness makes the fight less predictable and forces you to adapt on the fly. In Pokemon Colosseum, this mechanic is relevant for a majority of the game. Early on, trainers will all have static leads, which is meant to make them easier for the player, but that all changes when you encounter the first major boss of the game, Mirror B. Mirror B infamously uses 4 Ludicolo on his team, but they're actually all distinct. You can tell which is which based on their levels, which range from 28 to 31. He can lead with any random combination of Ludicolo, and he notably can't lead with his Shadow, as his AI is programmed to always send it out last. Now, I'm sure that most people who lost to Mirror B didn't even notice if he sent out a different pair of Ludicolo the second time, but it still changes how the fight progresses since they all have unique movesets. So honestly, it's a pretty subtle way to introduce the mechanic, which I find neat. But wrapping back around to Dakim, he shares most of the same traits as Mirror B, but with one key difference. He can lead with any of Golem, Camerupt, or Marshtomp, but no matter what, they will always be paired with Metang. This prevents Dakim from having either 2 water weaknesses or 2 grass weaknesses on the field turn 1. While this isn't that big of a deal for a high society member, for the niches, they can potentially get owned by a bad matchup. Now, in general, does this actually make the fight that much harder? Well, not really. But it's cool to me, so I wanted to talk about it. For you! Yay! And it is relevant to the speedrun, so you know what? I should have talked about it. On that note, let's go into how this fight works in the any % category, but before that, I just want to say, if you're still watching, thank you so much. I had so much fun making this, and if you want to see more videos about Colosseum, then please consider liking and subscribing. That would just make me so happy. Alright, so in Pokemon Colosseum any %, we use 2 main attackers, Espeon and Typhlosion, the latter starting out as a Shadow Quilava. These 2 are both fast special sweepers that learn powerful stab moves, and their types complement each other. The goal is to complete battles in as few turns as possible, and these 2 are by far the best at doing it. Now, we know that they both rank generously into my tier list for this fight, but that kind of assumes you have 4 more party slots to work with. On their own, they both have trouble dealing with Earthquake spam. Typhlosion just dies to Golem and Camerupt, and neither have the raw power necessary to 1-KO most of Dakim's team. So how do we beat this at all, let alone consistently? Well, there's two tricks we use to have the fight go our way, one of those being the X item glitch, an infamous exploit in Colosseum. In Gen 3 double battles, when you use an X item, it automatically applies to the Pokemon you used it with. You have no option of using it on your teammate like later games. This makes fights like Tata and Liza in the Sapphire and Emerald speedruns very inconvenient, as you have to set up one turn at a time. However, in Colosseum, there's a way around this. If you attempt to use an HP or status healing item on your teammate that would have no effect, for some reason the game gets confused, and in this state, if you use any X item, it applies to your teammate and not the Pokemon you used it with. This is huge, as it lets us use an X special on Espeon and attack with it in the same turn, which allows us to reach those 1-hit KO benchmarks before we can get Earthquaked. The second trick we use is called AI manipulation. Well, I mean, that's not what it's called, or it doesn't really have a name. I just made it up because it sounded cool. Now, I mentioned before how Dakim has special AI to alternate between Earthquake and Protect, which seems really bad here because if we don't guess right on who protects first, we're just dead. Well, thankfully, it turns out that Colosseum's trainer AI is very predictable. We can manipulate the fight so that regardless of the leads that Dakim sends out, we don't actually see Earthquake a single time the whole battle. Now, how do we do this? Well, I could just sit here and yap about how we play the fight turn by turn and why, but how about a little field trip outing instead? I feel the best way to demonstrate how battles work in Colosseum many percent would be to watch them firsthand with some insightful commentary on the side. So, you ready? Let's defeat Dakim. As mentioned before, Dakim always leads with any of his ground types plus Metang. Golem and Camerupt play out the same while Marshtomp is slower, so seeing Golem is good. This is because for Marshtomp lead, we see the Mudshot animation twice instead of once, which is time loss. Dakim's AI is set to always Earthquake with Metang first, so even though Golem can one-shot Typhlosion, it will still use Protect. Knowing this, I can safely knock out Metang with Typhlosion while setting up an X special on Espeon. Oh yeah, fun fact, did you know that Dakim is an anagram for admin? It's true. I used the X item glitch to further set up Espeon and Psybeam in the same turn. At +2 special attack, Espeon is now guaranteed to one-shot both Golem and Camerupt. Golem and Camerupt will now never use Protect, since 1, there aren't 2 Earthquake users in play, and 2, the AI knows they can one-shot Typhlosion, so Espeon can safely take out the other next turn. We intentionally leave Marshtomp alive as it always Mudshots Typhlosion, which is ultimately harmless. The speed drop doesn't matter, and a critical hit never kills. Typhlosion innately has Dig in Colosseum from being a Shadow Quilava, and it has some convenient applications throughout the run. Here, I use it to get some chip damage on Entei next turn, and as a bonus, I get to avoid a potential Mudshot crit as well. Entei is the most dangerous part of the fight. Because of its random stats, it can be extremely bulky. A +2 Psybeam is nearly impossible to one-shot it, and +3 is pretty much a coin flip. As a result, I have to let it have a turn while I wait for Typhlosion to give me the chip damage I need. Entei will always attack into Espeon this turn, and if I get crit, that's gonna be a dead run. Cool. Ideally, Dig does at least 25% of Entei's HP, but I didn't like this damage, so I just get Espeon to +3 to play it safe. If it feels like the menu is a bit hard to follow, that's because it is. The game straight up lets you make inputs in the bag and party screens before the UI is even visible, which I find pretty satisfying to do. Entei is about 3.6% to either outspeed or speed tie Espeon, which means that there's actually a small chance that Entei just wins a speed tie this turn and kills me. Not cool. And there you have it. That's pretty much all I have to share on Dakim today. Colosseum, both as a speedrun and a regular game, has a lot of funny things about it. There's stuff like the hidden mechanics behind shadow Pokemon, or how a Plusle is responsible for the disappearance of 5 people, you know, just like cool stuff. If any of that interests you, then why not subscribe? I also stream runs of this game over on Twitch, which you can find the link to in the description. Feel free to drop by and say hi sometime. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe even learned something new. And with that, I hope you have a great day. Bye bye.